So hello and welcome to this presentation. My name's Sam Hamilton. I'm the Director of Epidemiology and One Health within the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. This study is co-authored by my colleague and mentor Graham Garner, who's a visiting scientist at CSIRO and has spent time at EUFMD before. So we've called this talk, How Much is Enough? And used it to develop some case studies around modelling and other methods that have been used in Australia to guide investment in transboundary animal disease preparedness. And before I start, look, I'd really like to say I wish all of you as colleagues well for the end of 2020 wherever you are, and hope the next few weeks go okay for you. So a brief overview of the talk today. I'll talk a little bit about the Australian animal health context to set the scene and use some case studies to talk about how we've used modelling to identify resource requirements for disease eradication, how we've used simulation exercises to assess laboratory capacity, and how we've used performance assessments and standards and continue to do so within the Australian biosecurity system. So a brief slide about the animal health system in Australia because it is a little bit different. Australia is a federalised system of government. So our federal government, where I work, is responsible for national quarantine, international animal health issues, including liaison with FAO and OIE, and also the national coordination of disease surveillance and control initiatives amongst our state and territory governments. The state and territory governments are responsible for disease control, eradication within their jurisdictional borders. And Animal Health Australia is a not-for-profit publicly listed company that's responsible for national animal health programs, including national animal health surveillance information systems, farm biosecurity advice, and also emergency animal disease preparedness coordination. And it also has a strong liaison program with industry bodies. What's unique about Animal Health Australia is it's co-owned between Australian governments and industries, and it also is custodian of our Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement, which I'll talk about or touch upon later, which sets out how governments and industries collectively make decisions around disease control and also co-fund disease control initiatives. Another slide on the Australian context. We're about 1.6 times the size of the EU, but a very dry continent. We're about 80% of the landmass is desert, as you can see in the picture here. That means we've got relatively low livestock densities. Just to put that into context, we've got about 23 million beef cattle, 2.6 million dairy cattle, and just under 70 million sheep, and about 2.5 million pigs. Australia, being an island continent and very focused on biosecurity, is fortunate to be free from most of the diseases listed by EUFMD as fast diseases. So some of these include foot and mouth disease, PPR, Rift Valley fever, and lumpy skin disease. But one of the paradoxes about being free from these diseases means that it can be difficult to understand how these diseases might spread within the Australian environment and within Australian livestock populations. And that causes some challenges for our emergency animal disease preparedness policy. The sorts of public policy questions that come up from time to time in Australia are around what might the epidemiological and economic impacts of various diseases be, how effective are our early detection systems, the effectiveness of our contingency plans, particularly under current levels of resourcing, what are our diagnostic testing capacities, and how do we measure performance of our emergency preparedness system. And I think some of these will be common to many of the countries online today. So my colleagues and I have put together a paper that was published this year to propose this very simple framework for identifying and securing resources for emergency animal disease preparedness. And if you're interested, I'd recommend that you look at the link in the OIE Scientific and Technical Review. It sets out a very simple four-step process and proposes questions to consider and methods to assist answering those questions. So the steps in this process are firstly to assess the nature of the risks to be managed, to identify the types of resources required, to assess the availability of resources and identifying gaps in the resource availability, and then develop arrangements to ensure the availability of resources. So the sorts of questions we're dealing with today are around step 2, what sort of resources and skills and training are required. So Australia has a very long history in using epidemiological models to answer some of these questions, and my co-author Graham Garner has really led this initiative over the last 25 years. We've developed capacity to model a range of transboundary animal diseases, including foot and mouth disease, classical swine fever, avian influenza, and African swine fever, and also have capacity to model equine influenza, blue tongue, and also some TSEs. But by far and away, the most amount of work has been done on foot and mouth disease preparedness because it's the most consequential exotic disease for the Australian livestock industries, given how trade exposed we are. Over the years, modelling has been used to answer questions around contingency planning development, surveillance and resourcing, transmission of infection in various populations, including in what we'd call feral pigs, assessing the effectiveness of vaccination, looking at the animal welfare effects of movement controls, as well as coupling with economic analysis and also simulation exercises. So it's been used very extensively. So here's a case study on where simulation modelling has been used to estimate resource requirements. This study for foot and mouth disease responses. So this study came about after a 2011 review of Australia's preparedness for a foot and mouth disease outbreak, which made some concerning conclusions about our capacity to respond to a medium to large scale disease incursion. This study used the AusSpread simulation model, an existing platform that Graham Garner developed over many years, and studied medium to large outbreak scenarios. Within the model, it made assumptions about resource constraints for particular activities that would be required in a response. These included surveillance, the valuation of livestock to be culled, and resources for infected premises operations for stamping out. And it simulated disease control under 4 control scenarios. One, where there was unlimited resources available to control infection. Another, where there were just baseline or existing resources, existing government resources available to control disease. And also looked at 2 situations with an increased level of resourcing to see whether there would be any significant impact. By way of an example, here's some of the outputs. So on the y-axis, this study tracked the duration of the epidemic, and each column represents the different resourcing scenarios. So on the far left, under the baseline resources, so under the existing resources at the time of the study, 40% of outbreaks were still ongoing at 6 months, and 84% of outbreaks were still ongoing after 3 months, so some key benchmarks. With resource level 1 resources, which were assumed to be an extra 40 staff between day 25 and 42, and an extra 80 staff available for the response after that, well, all outbreaks were controlled within the 6-month time frame, with the longest duration of the outbreak being about 130 days. Importantly, 64% of outbreaks were controlled within that 3-month benchmark as well. Under resource scenario 2, where an extra 100 staff were available between day 25 and 42, an extra 200 staff were available after that. 100% of outbreaks again were controlled within 6 months, with the longest duration being a little bit less, 115 days, and 86% of the outbreaks were controlled within that 90-day or 3-month period. So, as you'd expect, increased performance with increased resourcing. Under the ideal situation, where resources were not constraining the response, field operations would require over 2,500 staff, a substantial increase. All outbreaks were controlled within 6 months, and 98% were controlled within 3 months. So what this study showed us is that with really a moderate increase in resources under the resource scenario 2, we can have a reasonably appropriate response to the outbreak. Onto another case study, this one around assessment of diagnostic capacity of our National Emergency Animal Disease Reference Laboratory, now called the Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness. So this exercise was a functional, highly pathogenic avian influenza exercise that occurred in 2007 that was used to evaluate the institution's testing capacity, its client relationships, and its operational management under emergency conditions. This study used what's called the EmergoTrain system, which is a system for functional exercises that can allow allocation of resourcing. It's a Swedish proprietary system, and I can share with you the link to the company's website if you like. It's mainly used for in the human health sphere, particularly in crisis management to mass casualty events. And just to briefly explain, it represents the resources available within an institution as a series of magnets which are used to move between particular stations, in this case whiteboards, throughout a process. Within this study, we tracked the movement of samples through the sample submission area and accessions, through a pass box, to isolation rooms, through into the PCR preparation area, nucleic acid extraction phase, through to the real-time PCR, and then reporting through a LIMS system. It was a functional exercise, so people were stationed in each room and were at each station, so to speak, and moved accession forms representing a series of samples through to each station as time passed. What made the exercise a little bit stressful, and something that we'd probably review, was that the exercise ran at 4 times speed with a sped up clock, and that caused a little bit extra stress, I would say, for the participants of the study, because time was running very fast. Whilst the study didn't involve real samples and didn't involve any of the laboratory suites within the laboratory itself, it did allow for communication with resource suppliers. So when particular reagents or materials were limiting, for example, fertile eggs, under the exercise scenario, individuals would ring up supply companies to see what sort of stock they'd have available. The study was quite successful and quite innovative, as I mentioned, and led to some really important outcomes that happened just months before the equine influenza outbreak in Australia in 2007, so it was very timely. It led to some recommendations about personnel management and capability, particularly transfer of staff between the research side of the laboratory into the diagnostic side of the laboratory. It also assessed the available equipment and reagents, made some recommendations about laboratory financing, and led to the development of a process modelling tool for the laboratory to assist with management of sample throughput through this very simple process. So on to a case study about qualitative performance measurement. So as I mentioned before, Australia has a cost-sharing deed between governments and industries that sets out how we would collectively make emergency management decisions in disease outbreaks and also share response costs. This deed also has some provisions around so-called normal commitments that each of the parties must meet in peacetime to fulfil their responsibilities of the deed. So the government responsibilities are reasonably straightforward and clear around having sufficient staff to detect incursions early, to investigate suspected disease outbreaks, diagnostics, legislation, etc. What's unique though is that there are requirements for industries as well to meet. And some of the things that they're expected to meet are to have sufficient qualified personnel to assist in decision making, to have frameworks in place to assist with cost sharing, the industry component of response costs. Industries must also support risk mitigation. That includes disease reporting and also developing biosecurity plans. They also have responsibilities around communications and providing support for industry around compensation and valuation, and also management of animal welfare. So some of the ways that the parties' responsibilities have been assessed under these normal commitments. Firstly, through the Performance of Veterinary Services Framework, and Australia undertook a national assessment of our performance of veterinary services by the OIE in 2015, and since then states and territories have undertaken self-assessments under a simplified framework to assess their normal commitments under the deed. Quite a substantial piece of work has been underway to develop an industry benchmarking tool so that their commitments under the cost sharing deed can be measured. And I think by now most industries have completed their first benchmarking exercise. So it's very much a work in progress. If you'd like to see some of the performance metrics that have been set out underneath this IADRA, you can find those in the link below. In 2020 and 2021, Australia's developing performance measurements for the whole of our biosecurity systems, and that doesn't just cover our emergency response capabilities, it also covers anticipation, prevention, screening of materials at the border, emergency preparedness, our detection capability, and response and recovery. And this doesn't just focus on terrestrial animal health, but also aquatic animal health, plant health, and also environmental health when we think about the impacts of pests and diseases. So it's quite an extensive piece of work. It's very much a work in progress, but the approach that's being used is to undertake a qualitative assessment using a maturity matrix framework. This is an older one that just demonstrates how this method works. It's a little bit small, but you can see down the left-hand column, there's a series of areas or measure that parties need to be measured against. So first is around the identifying the need to prepare, around its planning capability, resourcing, training and education, exercising, and its capacity to undertake evaluation and corrective action. And there are four measures that are used under this system. So the first is where a party may have an improvised level of preparedness. They've developed a higher level of preparedness. That's now become an evolved level of preparedness. And the final stage is an optimized level of preparedness. So I just thought we might zoom in on the resourcing requirements for the optimized level of preparedness just for your information. So under this, a party would assess themselves to have human resource capacity and capability that's been evaluated in a real or simulated response, that the physical resourcing has been evaluated as well, that financial resource arrangements have been evaluated, and that systems or processes to support response arrangements have also been evaluated as well. So again, it's very much a work in progress, but I'm sure that in the coming years, Australia will be able to provide more information on how we're achieving this. So I asked a very provocative question at the start of this talk: how much is enough when it comes to emergency preparedness investments? And I haven't answered that question. The reason why I haven't is because I believe it's a value judgment for decision makers based on the nature of the risks, the contexts that an agency or the country faces, and also a realistic assessment of the resources that are available. What I've shown you though is 3 examples where epidemiological modelling, simulation exercises, and qualitative performance metrics can be used to assess current and desired performance. Even for a developed country like Australia, this is very much a work in progress, and over the coming years, I'm sure we'll have more to add in this space. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions at the end of the session. Bye.